When people think of holiday truces during wartime, they almost always remember the famous Christmas truce of 1914. But hardly anyone knows that New Year's Day brought its own quieter moments of peace in World War II. These weren't official truces, and you won't find them written in most history books. They were just short, fragile moments when soldiers, tired, cold, and thousands of miles from home, stopped fighting long enough to let a little bit of hope in. Our first story takes place on the Italian front in the winter of 1944. Snow covered the mountains like a thick, white blanket, and American troops were dug into frozen trenches, battling the cold as much as the enemy. They weren't expecting anything special for New Year's Day. On the battlefield, one day just bled into the next. But that night, something strange happened. The constant, deafening sound of gunfire slowly started to fade. First one rifle stopped, then another. Soon there were no shots, no artillery shells whistling overhead, just silence. A rare, powerful silence that felt heavier than any explosion. Across the valley, German troops were also quiet. Everyone was exhausted from months of brutal, grinding combat. The New Year wasn't supposed to be a holiday out here, but for just a moment, everyone acted like it was. Then, American soldiers heard something faint drifting through the cold night air. It was music. An accordion playing a slow, melancholic tune. Someone on the other side was celebrating in their own small way. Instead of using the sound to pinpoint a target, the troops just listened. Some of them even managed a small smile, a brief flicker of warmth in the freezing dark. A few hours later, both sides used the stillness to do something extraordinary. They began pulling their wounded soldiers back from the deadly no-man's land. Men who had been lying there for hours, exposed and helpless, were carefully retrieved. No one shot. No one interfered. There was just this silent, unspoken respect. That one night of quiet saved lives. It was all because the New Year reminded everyone, on both sides of the line, that they were still human, sharing the same cold and the same distant hope for home. Now, let's move to the Ardennes forest during the Battle of the Bulge. The fighting there was some of the most intense of the entire war. But on New Year's Eve, 1944, something else arrived. A massive, blinding snowstorm. Visibility dropped to almost zero. Tanks, which were the steel heart of the offensive, froze in place, their engines refusing to turn over. Soldiers on patrol could barely see their own boots, let alone an enemy soldier a few feet away. The storm was so powerful, it forced both sides to stop fighting. This wasn't a truce born from agreement. It was a truce enforced by survival. American units, realizing the battle had been put on hold by nature itself, used the whiteout conditions to their advantage. They began sneaking down snow-clogged forest paths on a different kind of mission, rescuing trapped civilians. Families had been hiding for days in basements, barns, and cellars, caught in the crossfire. Now, under the cover of the swirling snow, soldiers carried them to safety, wrapped in blankets and tarps to shield them from the biting wind. One soldier later recalled, "The snow saved them. The war paused because nature said so." When the weather finally eased a day later, the battlefield had changed. But those civilians, those families, survived because the New Year brought a wall of snow strong enough to silence the war, even if just for a little while. You might think the Pacific Theater, known for its fierce and unrelenting combat, would have no room for such moments. But even there, something remarkable happened. On New Year's Day 1943, on an island cloaked in dense jungle, both American and Japanese forces experienced a rare mutual pause in firing. No one planned it. No one announced it. But that morning, the jungle, which was usually filled with the crack of rifles and the thud of mortar, was eerily quiet. The constant tension that defined life on the front lines eased, just for a few hours. American medics immediately took the chance. They moved through the thick vegetation, locating wounded Marines who who were too close to the front lines and carrying them deeper into safe zones. It was slow, painstaking work that would have been impossible under fire. At the same time, local island families, who had been caught in the war's path, used the quiet to slip through the forest, following the soldiers toward safety. One Marine later wrote about it, saying, "We didn't celebrate, we didn't relax, but we got people out who would have died if even one shot had been fired. It was a fragile moment, the kind of moment that disappears. The Second War remembers itself." But for those who were saved, that silent New Year meant everything. It was the difference between life and death. Our final story isn't from a battlefield, but from a city under siege. London during the Blitz was a place of constant terror. Explosions, fire, and thick smoke choked the air almost every night for months. The wail of air raid sirens was the city's grim soundtrack. But on New Year's Day 1941, something unusual happened. The skies were quiet. There were no German bombers overhead, no anti-aircraft guns firing into the night. No bombs fell. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, there was peace. British and American volunteer fire crews and rescue teams rushed to use the precious calm. They scrambled over mountains of debris, pulling survivors from the wreckage of collapsed buildings. They administered first aid to dozens of injured people right there on the street. They worked tirelessly to clear still burning debris, to prevent fires from spreading, and guided terrified families through the dark, rubble-strewn roads to safe shelters. For the first time in weeks, the people of London heard the sound of church bells ringing in the new year instead of sirens. One American volunteer wrote home, "That New Year's Day felt like the city took a breath. And in that breath, we saved who we could." It wasn't a truce between armies, but it was a truce from the sky, and it saved countless lives on the home front. These stories may not be as famous or as grand as other wartime events. They are small, personal, and often forgotten. But they show us something extraordinary, that even in a world consumed by war, even in freezing trenches, dense jungles, and ruined cities, the idea of a new year brought moments of shared humanity. They were moments when soldiers stopped fighting, not because they were ordered to, but because they chose to. Moments when the weather itself forced a fragile peace. Moments when compassion and survival instincts saved lives. The new year became a quiet reminder that even in the darkest of times, hope still finds a way to break through. These small unofficial truces might not appear in our history books, but for the people who were rescued, for the families who were reunited, and for the soldiers who survived another day because of a moment of quiet, those moments meant absolutely everything. Thanks for watching. If you found these stories as moving as I did, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more hidden histories. See you next time.